Yeah.
Are you ready to do it again with sound this time?
Yes.
Yeah, let's try it again.
That was just a joke.
Hey everybody. Welcome to the first live stream of Dauntless's official launch. I am here with...
Bunhead what?
You said frickin' what last
I
time?
did say Bunhead frickin' what.
You did. And I'm Crash7800. And of course we work at Phoenix Labs. We're here at Phoenix Labs HQ.
Yeah.
And the one thing they don't teach us here is how to unmute the mic. But we got that, and so I think we're good.
We've got rhyme skills.
Yeah. So today's a big day. It's the first day that Dauntless is kind of officially launched.
Yeah.
And an extra big day is that we are the first game to ever launch with crossplay.
Yeah,
which is
we
pretty
are.
wild. So what does that mean for everybody watching at home if they don't know?
What does crossplay mean?
Yeah.
It means you can play with all your friends.
What if all of my friends are on PlayStation?
You can play with your friends on
but
PlayStation.
But I'm on Xbox.
Yeah, you can play with them.
Okay, but what about my sister who plays on PC?
You can play with her.
And my cousin who plays on his Dreamcast.
You could not play with them.
Oh.
Welcome back, Slayers. Welcome back to the Broken Blade Tavern in Ramsgate in the Shattered Isles of Dauntless. Welcome back. So this episode has been a long time coming. In fact, I actually stated well over a year ago that I was going to be releasing it, closer to a year and a half. And in that time, I haven't really released any content whatsoever, other than the video I released a couple of days ago, which was basically me just sharing the final moments I had recorded in Ramsgate before the Dauntless servers were switched off. If you are feeling a little bit nostalgic or sentimental about our old friends in Dauntless, I'd highly recommend going and checking out that video that I released. I'll leave a link in the description. I think one of the key takeaways, or one of the things that hit me most when I went back to watch it, was the in-game chat. It was a real shame seeing so many players in that lobby just pouring their little hearts out. Very emotional at the fact that the game was about to shut down and it was the final minutes of that game before it would be gone forever. And if you actually think about it, imagine a game like World of Warcraft, for example, an enormous worldwide MMO, one of the most popular games in the world. Imagine the servers for that were to shut down. I believe it would make headline news. I think there would be panic in the streets. It would be crazy because it would be such a big deal to so many people. Now, the only difference with the Dauntless server shutting down is that it's less people. It is still such a big deal. It is still such a life-changing thing for so many people. It's just less popular than a game like World of Warcraft. If I'm being completely honest, I think the Dauntless servers shutting down and going offline indefinitely impacted me much more than I'm willing to admit to myself. I think it impacted my enthusiasm and my genuine interest in creating any kind of content whatsoever. And not to mention my video gaming habits as well. My interest in video games probably hasn't been quite the same since either. Now, Dauntless isn't the only thing that I ever played. As I've openly admitted many times before, it's not the greatest game that was ever created. However, it was an enormous part of my life, and from what I'm hearing for many other people's lives within the community as well. But anyway, we won't go on about that too much just now because we've got a lot to fit into this podcast episode. I've got so many things that I'd like to talk about. When putting this together, I couldn't decide on how I wanted to go about it. Did I want to do it with a group of people like I've done many times in the past? In fact, we've had some wonderful guests on this show already in previous episodes. I mean, at the top of my head, well, we've had Eyes Fluffy, we've had the wonderful Shireen Plays, we've had the hilarious Danny T, the incredible Swift and Deadly. My goodness, there's not many people who made content like Swift and Deadly. Geo Era, of course, the behemoth that is the channel that is Glitch is. It was such a privilege to have him on the show because he was my go-to Dauntless content creator before I knew very much about the game at all, way back in the day. And then, of course, we've had a Dauntless dev on as well, Belden Pham, one of the animators, and it was just really, really good to kind of get an insight of what went on behind the scenes at Dauntless. And then I thought about, well, because I'm very rusty. It's been nearly a year and a half since I've made any content, and I'm out of touch from a lot of people as well. I've kind of flew under the radar for quite a long time now. That I would just do the episodes myself, like I did with the first three or four episodes of the podcast. It was just me rambling on and enthusing about the game. But no, I've decided on a bit of a hybrid. I will do the bulk of this podcast by myself. However, I do have some of the former gang who are going to be stopping in just to share bits and bobs, just to share, how they're doing, what their fond memories are, if they have any hopes for the future, and some of the regrets they might have as well. We've got Shireen Plays, Danny T, and we've also got Eyes Fluffy, who now goes by the Shadow Strider. So it'll be good to see what they have to say, and their input into the podcast is always appreciated. So to get us started, I'm just going to summarise what it is we're actually going to talk about. To begin with, we're going to look at the history of the game, the Dauntless Timeline, all the way back from the alpha, way back in 2017, right up to the shutdown in the spring of 25. We're then going to talk about fond memories and the community, all the good things that make us miss this game so much. We're then going to talk about where it all went wrong. What went wrong for the game? Why couldn't it recover from the difficult situation that it was dealing with? Why couldn't the devs turn it around? We're then going to talk about a wish list for the future, as in, what would make us happy? What would we like to see? The game returning somehow, which is probably impossible, or a spiritual successor, or something like that. And then finally, we're going to talk about the future of my channel. Far less interesting, let's be honest. However, I need to head in some kind of direction with this channel. I enjoy doing this. And for a long time, I've been very indecisive on, whether coming back or not at all, but then what to be focusing on if I did. And I believe I've now made up my mind. So we'll be talking about that. And for those of you that want to follow me through that journey, you are most welcome. So, first up, the Dauntless History Timeline. Now, think back to when you first found out about this game. Have a think about it. What was the first thing you saw? Was it a trailer? Was it an ad? Did you already know the developers? Whatever it was. If I was to think about how where I found out about the game for the first time, I believe it was during a trailer which released at E3, and I want to say it was 2018. I think it would have been about 2018, because if it was in the alpha phase in 2017, which I missed, as well as the beta, it was just after the beta that I started playing Dauntless, I believe. So it must have been 2018 E3. They released that trailer. And I believe it was Kat Sorrell or something. She was wandering through an island, and she was being hunted by a behemoth, and that was the first time I ever saw it. And I remember seeing the comment sections, and everyone was. I think some people were quite impressed, but everyone basically thought, "Oh, look, it's Monster Hunter with a Fortnite art style." I disagreed slightly. It did have some elements of that generic Fortnite look about it, but I thought there was a bit more of a stylized, whimsical fantasy kind of look about it as well, and it did intrigue me. It was something that I thought it looked really interesting, exciting. I loved the behemoth design. I think it was a Shrike was the first behemoth I ever saw during that trailer. I believe it was a Shrike anyway. And that's when I started following it. I remember checking out the website and then signing up, I believe, for the closed beta, the open beta at the time. So yeah, that was where I first found out about Dauntless. Now, it launched early in the alpha stage on the 18th of August 2017, and then it went into the beta in September of 2017. Now that was just now. That's 9 years ago, nearly 10 years ago. That's insane. And it fully released on the 21st of May 2019, which funnily enough isn't actually too far away from when the game shut down in terms of the date. The Dauntless shut down on the 29th of May 25, and it began on the 21st, which is quite interesting. Little side note there. It originally launched on the PC, on PlayStation and Xbox on the 21st, and then it came to the Switch on the 10th of December 2019, and that is when I really got stuck into this game. I played this game religiously when it came out on the Switch, even though the port was terrible at launch. It was so poor, and I know quite a lot of people criticise the Switch ports of Dauntless, but it wasn't always the case. There was phases in the middle where the Switch played it fairly well. It ran fairly well. There was a bit of lag here and there, but it was okay. It wasn't at the beginning though. I remember Ramsgate was running around about 10 to 15 frames a second. It was much more smooth out during the hunts, but in Ramsgate, oh my goodness, it was like a slideshow, I remember. But no, I played that very consistently during that phase. I remember the game was very linear at that time. Obviously, you only really had the hunts, and you only had a handful of the original behemoths as well, and armors and weapons and hunt passes and things like that. Plenty of content to keep you going, but nowhere near the amount that people wanted at the time. And I remember when it first launched on the Xbox and PlayStation and eventually the Switch, the servers were so overloaded that the game couldn't keep up, and so many people were kicked out, and there was long waiting times and all sorts of server issues. I just don't think the developers had actually planned on such a big reception, which is crazy to think, because as the numbers dwindled as the years went on, you forget how many people actually played this game to begin with. It was very popular when it first came out. I remember being in a queue for a very, very, very long time, and then getting into Ramsgate and then losing connection because the servers were just so overloaded, and doing that on repeat for quite a long time, until eventually enough people got pissed off and left, and then the servers quieted down a bit, which suited me nicely. But you do wonder if that original hiccup at launch did put off a lot of people, and maybe some of them never came back. Now, as far as I can remember, when the servers eventually kind of sorted themselves out, not that they were ever perfect, but when things became much improved and much more consistent, new content was added in abundance. I mean, you think about the trials which were added, that in-game content which so many people competed on over the leaderboards. I myself got up there for a little while as well. I was never the best, but making the leaderboards and getting my gold crown and doing what I had to do at that late game stage was something I was very proud of. And then you think about all the behemoths they added over the years as well. I mean, I think of the Shroud. I remember the trailer for that one, the terrifying Shroud. Think of the Chronovore. You think of the Savite, and that amazing soundtrack it came with. There's been so many behemoths. I used to love when the Dauntless social media pages and YouTube would post a teaser for a new behemoth. It got me very, very excited. The first thing I wanted to know was, what kind of creature it was and what types of attacks it would have. It gave me a lot of excitement. There was so much personality, and even the easiest behemoth, they all had such wonderful little personalities, and I do miss them dearly. Even those Nashers and Nizagas and Shrikes and who else? The Hellions, and so many behemoths that we'll just never really see again. But they added them consistently, and on top of that, I mean, you got hunt passes. I mean, if you go into the Dauntless wiki, it's quite interesting actually. You can see an entire list of all the hunt passes that released in Dauntless and the dates that they came out. Now, the first hunt pass that came out on Dauntless was Frostfall of 2018. And I do remember that. I remember that hunt pass. That launched, I think it actually coincided, or it came out just before the Switch version launched. So I remember a very, very laggy Ramsgate and seeing Gregario's shop all decorated in Frostfall event items. Then there was the Saints Bond. I'm just going to go through these because it's quite interesting actually. You had the Saints Bond. I don't remember too much about that. I think that was a wee while after. Of course, it was Valentine's Day event. Of course, yeah, not one of my favourite events, as you can tell. Then you had Overgrown, which was such a good hunt pass, such a good theme. In fact, probably one of my favourite themes there was, and that was the Farslayers, and came with it also, obviously, Zelia Farslayer, who lingered in Ramsgate, and all the cosmetics and the Farslayer outfits that came with that, and the weapon transmogs as well. Then we had Burndown. Let's see, I don't remember too much about this one. Oh, I think this was, this was the Barbarian Hunt Pass. Yeah, I don't remember too much about that one. Maybe I kind of gave up with the lag for a little bit during that Hunt Pass, although we would have seen it again, because in the later stages of Dauntless, obviously, they re-released these Hunt Passes over and over again. Quick side note, it's came back to me now, another really funny moment from within the Dauntless community. I remember every single Dauntless post that was shared on Twitter and YouTube, Facebook, everything, there was the same one guy, I can't remember his name, I need to go and do some digging, but he would post the same thing on every single post that Dauntless made, begging them to re-release the Barbarian Hunt Pass because he really wanted the armour that came with it. I remember he would post it all the time, and me and my friend, Renegade Electris, we played the game very consistently around about 2020. We would find it so funny that he desperately wanted that Hunt Pass back again, and I remember they did bring it back, so I can imagine that player finally got what he wanted, which was a very, very scantily clad cloth armour, which we just found absolutely hilarious. Then you had the Hidden Blades. I remember this one well. I believe that was the Japanese themed one. Yes, it was like a kind of samurai ninja themed, I think, Hunt Pass, which I guess clashed with that kind of Norse mythology of Dauntless, but whatever. And what I'll do is I'll leave a link in the description. You can go through all these Hunt Passes. Haunted Shadows, let me just check that one. That was a Dark Harvest 2019, so that was the first Dark Harvest event transmog armor set. Myth and Legend, sorry. The Etherpunk one, I was never keen on the Etherpunk event, Hunt Pass. I just thought it was just a little bit silly. It really took me out of the world of Dauntless a little bit. Other people disagree, but that was just my opinion. Clear Skies was a really good Hunt Pass. I like that one. The Realm of Ice. Oh, is that the one? One of my favourite ones. Nope, it's not that one. Cold Front, maybe? Was that the one? Cold Front. That was one of my favourites, probably after the Farslayer one, and that was the Frostwarden transmog sets and items, and I believe that might have coincided with the Frost escalation. Now, I could go on about Hunt Passes all day, but speaking of escalations, I mean, that was another thing they added. Obviously, that it kind of mimicked that dungeon aspect. So you had escalations, and you had your Blaze, and you had your Terra. All these escalations. The Agaris was such a how did I explain it? I loved the Agaris, but I hated the Agaris. It was probably the first escalation that I completed at the more difficult level, and I was very proud of myself in getting that armor set, obviously. But yeah, so much content was added as time went on. Okay, so to summarise where we're at now, 2017, the alpha, late 2017, the beta, full release in May of 2019. We've built up a heck of a player base, a lot of good content. You have your Dauntless Hunts, you have your Escalations, your Trials, you've got all these Hunt Passes. Dauntless, as it comes into 2020, I think it's fair to say it's in its prime. It's in its heyday, especially going into the COVID pandemic. I mean, video games and streams and everything, live services like Netflix and everything, all took off during this time because so many people around the world were stuck indoors. There was little else to do. And I myself was stuck indoors. I was furloughed from a job. I had all the time in the world. I had the entire summer when I was off university. And I spent most of that time playing Dauntless, and it's when I created this channel as well, and I really discovered, my strengths and weaknesses in terms of creating content and, my knowledge of video games. It was a very difficult time for many, but it was also quite an enjoyable time for some, because it gave us the time to put into things like these live service games like Dauntless. A very basic Google search will tell you that Dauntless peaked in late 2020 to early to mid 2021. That is when the most amount of active players were, active. It says here that there was an estimated 15 million active players capitalising on a surge in global gaming during the COVID pandemic. I'm not sure I agree with those numbers, but that's what Google is telling me. The RPG reached several major early milestones, including passing 10 million players in the first month of its 2019 open beta launch, so it got off to a good start. However, by 2022, it had exceeded 30 million registered users. So you can see that during the COVID pandemic, I mean, I don't know if I agree with these numbers. That is what J-Man on YouTube has reported, apparently. But that seems to highlight that the player base intensified. There were so many new players that came to Dauntless during the COVID pandemic, and I can account for much of that. I introduced many people to this game, be it my friends or be it my social circle on YouTube. I was streaming the game, and lots of other people were as well. So this was the heyday of Dauntless, the absolute pinnacle of the community, as many people would probably consider. And then on the 3rd of December 2020, so a fair wee bit into the COVID pandemic, the first lockdowns had all been and gone. I remember I was back to work again, working night shifts, playing Dauntless on my night shifts, funnily enough. And then the Reforge update was shared. I remember them talking about it and building up to it. There was a lot of excitement because there was a lot of the player base who were complaining that there was more content needed, that the gameplay was becoming quite repetitive as well, and Reforge was supposed to fix this. Now, I remember basically the statement they threw around a lot was to stay and slay. I loved this. I really, really enjoyed the thought of being able to stay and slay. That was one thing that I maybe bugged me about early Dauntless, was the fact that it was quite linear in the sense that it completely copied the Monster Hunter mechanics or formula, you could call it, and that you had your hub and then you would go out and slay a monster / behemoth and you would instantly return. I liked that aspect. It was simplistic. You were able to take on these wonderful unique behemoths, craft your armor. It was a very simple time. However, I wanted more. I wanted more exploration. I wanted more time just to immerse myself in the world of Dauntless rather than being on a timer. And that's exactly what they brought. Now, Reforge can be controversial, and I'm not going to ignore the fact that it was controversial. I believe that it split the player base straight down the middle. There were people who thought it was an incredible update and one of the best things to come to Dauntless, and it added so much more depth and replayability. And then there were others who thought it completely ruined Dauntless and probably negatively impact how many players were actually continued to play the game after this update. It could have been the start of the decline. I don't believe it is. I do believe that Dauntless was maybe beginning to dwindle and inevitably would have dwindled anyway. But you could say that Reforged, despite the fact I am a huge fan of Reforged, it probably is my favourite update for Dauntless, you could say that maybe began the snowball effect for the decline of Dauntless, because possibly, it might have introduced many players, but it maybe put off many established long-term players. So it's just food for thought, really. So continuing on through time, after that update in December of 2020, Dauntless just kind of, kept going for a good while. Player base was decent. Most people were fairly happy, in my opinion. There was ongoing content. You had new hunting ground islands, you had new behemoths, new hunt passes. You think of behemoths like the Chronivore and the hunting grounds that came with that. Chronivore was really, really cool behemoth. The Phalanx, even cooler. The Phalanx, the way that it was some kind of mutated lab experiment gone wrong, and you could summon it, much like the Chronivore, almost into like kind of an arena. It was just very epic. So yeah, still quite a lot of ongoing content after Reforge for quite a wee while as well. And that's not even talking about the seasonal events. You think of like the Ramsgiving, the Frostfall, the Dark Harvest. These seasonal events were the peak of Dauntless, in my opinion, especially that Dark Harvest. That was my most enjoyable time of year. They really knocked it out of the park with the theme for Ramsgate, with some of the challenges you had to get. That Dark Harvest crown, oh my goodness, I've talked about that in great detail in some of my older videos. Getting that crown was the biggest challenge I have ever faced in any game ever. Some people managed to do it quite easily, but most people, from what I hear, really struggled. I remember that time of year would just be people doing the event over and over again, trying to kill that Bloodshot Shroud with the right amount of flare still lit. It was a great challenge, and when I finally pulled it off, as I said in one of my older podcasts, I was ecstatic. I remember celebrating with the other players who I'd randomly bumped into to achieve it in Ramsgate for a very long time. We just partied away in town for so long, celebrating the fact that we finally got those crowns. And it was a heck of a road getting there. I remember the frustration from so many players. Some believed that it was impossible to get, that the game was rigged or bugged or glitched out, and it was just not going to happen. A lot of frustration, which was just made it so much better when I finally got it. And it's funny because, you think about all the time that you spend trying to achieve these things in games, for it to mean very, very little, I guess, when the game's shut down. I guess that's not true, because you've got the memories and you've got the experience and you've got, the moments you had, which we all share. But now that the game's shut down, that crown no longer exists. It's not in my arsenal anymore. Quite a deep psychological rabbit hole to go down, which we won't do right now. We'll save that for later. But anyway, as I was saying before I went off on another tangent, oh God, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so content. Yeah, content did continue for quite a fair while after Reforge. Now, looking at again back on the Dauntless wiki, you've got that list of all the hunt passes, all the seasons, and it kind of gives you a good idea of when content started to slow down. You have a total of 28 different hunt passes that came to Dauntless since the very beginning on the 6th of December 2018, and at the very end, actually not, because there was one on the 3rd of March 2022, and then we did get that one that came out after the Awakening, so I guess that would be 29 hunt passes. Yeah, of the 29 hunt passes that have been released in total, we'll say 28 because one was after the Awakening update, we won't talk about that just now. Of the 28 that you have, only 10 released after the Reforge update. In 2 years, around about 2 years, and almost exactly 2 years from launch and up until the Reforge update on the 3rd of December 2020, you had 18. And between the 3rd of December 2020, right up until the Awakening update, which was round about 5 years, you only had 10. So that really shows you how the content that came to Dauntless began to stagnate. And you can see a lot of these dates are condensed in the first year and a half. Following 2022, there was very, very little. And in my opinion, maybe not everyone's opinion, but my opinion, the quality of some of these hunt passes, they did drop a little bit, I would say. And then obviously, later down the line, they would just repeat old hunt passes, they would re-release them. People were getting a little bit fed up, but some people saw opportunity because they were getting hunt passes that they'd never used before. But it does show you that things started to slow down and stagnate in the year or year and a half after the Reforge update. Now, moving further through time, we're getting towards the end of 2024, November 2024 to be exact, and content has been few and far between. The player base has dwindled to probably its lowest point ever, I would imagine. It's getting a little bit trickier to find people to team up with in escalations and in trials and things like that. And Ramsgate's just beginning to get a little bit repetitive. So, obviously concerns are raised a little bit. However, there is finally an announcement. The Awakening is announced. And it's announced on the 28th of November 2024. That's when we first found out about this Awakening update. And myself and many others were very, very excited. Finally, this game that we have thrown so much of our time into, we've enjoyed for the previous 6-7 years, we're finally getting an overhaul. Not just new content, but we're getting an overhaul as we know it. And it's going to improve every aspect of the game, and it's going to get right everything that we don't quite enjoy about Dauntless, and it's going to give us a future. Or so we thought. So, when this announcement came out, as I said, there was a lot of excitement. However, they basically stated that the update would not come until the summer of 2025. So you're talking about 7.5 months, maybe a little bit more than that we were going to have to wait for this update. And they also stated that there wouldn't be any content whatsoever released, any new content, released during this time. They were still going to repeat some old hunt passes, they were still going to repeat the same old seasonal events. And I still enjoyed my time during that period, but it was a long wait. And it was made even longer because it didn't come out in the summer of 2025. I remember waiting, June, July, August, and it was right into September, I believe, when they stated that it would then release in November. And then November came, and it was delayed again until December. However, it eventually came out on the 5th of December 2025. Now, some people were invited to try out some aspects of the new update prior to its release. I can't remember exactly when that was. It was very random how they distributed those invitations. I mean, even partners, I remember talking to Glitches, he didn't get an invitation even though he was a Dauntless partner with a very big channel and a good audience. I wasn't invited, but some other people were, so we couldn't really work out if it was just completely randomly distributed. But anyway, it came out on the 5th of December, and the rest is history. Despite the fact that I basically complained about the fact that there was essentially no new content in the entire year when Awakening was in development, and the player base dwindled to the point that it was so low, I remember, at some points. But it was actually quite an enjoyable time for my channel, personally, if I'm looking at it from a selfish point of view. My channel basically became a news outlet for the Awakening update, and I loved making content for it. I loved scouring the internet, looking for any kind of information or clue or anything I could come across which would reveal information about this Awakening update. I began this podcast, which essentially just spoke specifically about the Awakening update, speculation. I brought on guests, so it was very enjoyable from my point of view. However, I can imagine it was very frustrating for other people because it meant that there was an entire year without any new content, and much longer than that because there wasn't any new content for the 6 months, year prior to that. I mean, we had the Alira behemoth, one of the newest behemoths. We had the Alira load screen on Dauntless for about 3 years or something. So it was a very long time without any updates at all. But anyway, Awakening came out, and the reviews were terrible. The feedback was terrible. The game launched on Steam and it was review bombed, and it was a difficult one to take. I and many people in my social circle, we defended the Dauntless Awakening update, and there's still many things that I would still continue to defend. I made countless videos about it. There was a podcast episode that we released, and it was called In Defense of Dauntless the Awakening, and it got quite a lot of hate, probably justifiable looking back at it, but there was things that I enjoyed about the update. You had new behemoths, you had the fauna, the Carconos, which was incredible, the Twilight Domain, which was an absolutely beautiful hunting ground. You had weapon swapping, which was revolutionary. Really quite exciting. It had the potential to allow you to create some very, very unique and intricate builds. And there was new hunt passes and things like that. So there was some things that were good, but overall, it was an update that sunk the Dauntless ship. There were so many issues with it that we can't really blame so many people leaving such bad feedback, and that maybe contradicts what I used to say. But looking back on it now, what was it they were called again? That loot box system. Can't even remember the name. I think I've buried that at the back of my mind. But that loot box system was so predatory. So predatory. I think taking away weapons, especially my legendary weapons. I love my legendary weapons. That was huge. People worked hard for those weapons. The reforged system was gone, obviously. They brought in some crowns to, they gave to people who had reforged set amount of times. It didn't really justify the effort that was put in, but it was a nice addition. And obviously just locking so much behind a paywall, I think that was the cherry on top, essentially. So in the weeks following the Awakening update, the fire only spread, people only really got angrier, and the stance that the development team took, I think it probably wasn't too encouraging, looking back on it. I released a video called Genuine Fixes Which Might Save Dauntless. It was quite a long video, it was about half an hour actually. And in it, I talked about every single aspect of the Dauntless Awakening update. I'd highly recommend it if you are interested in looking back. It's not very helpful now because Dauntless is dead and gone, but I talked about every single aspect, positive and negative, and I talked about what I believed would appease most of the player base. I came up with some kind of system, like a system which established the likelihood that Dauntless would survive. From that system I basically used like kind of a form of calculation based on negative reviews and player retention. From that system I basically established that there was no hope in hell that Dauntless was going to survive, even if they appeased the player base, even if they did right all the wrongs. My calculations and conclusions basically stated that it was impossible. It was too late. Too many players had dropped off. Too many people were angry. The reviews were too poor, and Dauntless would shut down. And I was right, unfortunately. I remember actually getting a little bit almost upset when I was doing those calculations, because I did it over and over again, and I just couldn't get the numbers to match in a way that suited what I wanted for the game. Dauntless did shut down shortly after. In fact, Awakening was only out a matter of months. It came out in December, and by the 24th of February, they announced that Dauntless would be shutting down. I think we already knew it was coming. The update was a disaster as far as the game was concerned, and then we got the news that the entire development team had been let go, including my good friend Belden Pham. He was let go, and they were devastated. It was their jobs, it was their livelihoods. They were all let go, the entire team, which was horrendous. And it further shows, and I don't want to get into it too much just now, but a lot of the frustration from the community, and I'll argue this, I will die on this hill. A lot of the frustration from the community was directed at the developers. Now, the development team. Now, the development team were artistic, they were capable, they were competent, they were incredibly talented in ways that most people in this world are not, including myself. It's the bigwigs, it's the uppers, it's the suits, it's the acquisition of 40 Labs that took over Dauntless and left it out on the street to die. Now, you could argue Dauntless was already beginning to dwindle, you could argue that the player base was dropping off. However, all it would have took was probably some consistent new content to keep the game going. It didn't have... Why does every game need to be enormous these days to continue? Why do these big companies like Microsoft shut down games that are just doing okay? They're just getting by. They've got nice, they've got nice communities. They've got, good loyal player bases which enjoy the game, but they shut it down because it's not quite bringing in the money that they want it to bring in. And that's what's happened here. 40 Labs has invested very little into Dauntless. There was very few people working on this update, from what I was hearing from the inside, and they bled it dry for all they could. All these predatory microtransactions and paywalls and loot boxes, that was them. So the frustration that was aimed at the development team was wrong, in my opinion, and that frustration should be aimed at 40 Labs and the people who are responsible for the takeover of Dauntless, unfortunately. And then finally, moving further through the future to the very end, on the 29th of May 2025, Dauntless shut down for good. That was it. Myself and many other players logged in for that last night in the Shattered Isles, right up until the servers were switched off, and it was incredibly difficult. A lot of people in the in-game chat pouring out their emotions and their appreciation and their nostalgic memories of the game, and then it was switched off and we were reverted back to the title screen, and we've never been back in Ramsgate since, which was a very difficult one to take, unfortunately. And quite frankly, it's probably the toughest thing I've dealt with in my gaming life, I would say. And I know that there's many out there that would agree with that. But anyway, I have rambled on far more than I had planned. This was just meant to be a podcast opener where I talked about the history up until the present of Dauntless, and here we are, 42 minutes in, and we're still talking about it because I've basically talked about things that I had planned for later sections. But that's fine, we can talk about it then as well. 2017 till 2025, 8 years of Dauntless, the highs, the lows, the ups, the downs. What a ride it was, and I was glad to be a part of it. Anyway, moving on to fond memories and the community of Dauntless, which hopefully should put a much more positive spin on this podcast. It got a little bit grim, a little bit dark there towards the end of that last section, just talking about the shutdown and a lot of the negativity around the Awakening update, unfortunately. But to help me talk about, the positives of Dauntless, all the good bits, the community, and all the enjoyable moments we had, I've brought in some of the old team. And it's great to have them back, even if it is just for a few minutes. We've got Ice Fluffy, who's now known as the Shadow Strider. We've got Shireen Plays and Danny T.
What is up, everyone? Ice Fluffy here, aka Stallion, also now known as the Shadow Strider. I want to go ahead and thank Dragon Lauren for giving me this opportunity to talk to you guys about what Dauntless meant to me. It wasn't really much of a game, it was more of a community for me, basically. For me, Dauntless pretty much saved my life because I basically, dealt with depression. I was always busy with work and came home tired, so whenever I came home from work, I had Dauntless, to help me unwind, basically, and help me, decompress. And then whenever I was also depressed, Dauntless was also there, it was helping me with, most of the emotions and all the stuff. But that is not the only thing that made Dauntless great. For me, it was also the sense of community, the many friends that I made. I got to meet Dragonlord, for example. We got to meet each other through Dauntless, and that is how we became friends. So for me, Dauntless, it was much more than a game. It was a sense of community, basically. So it's kind of sad that the game had to end the way that it ended, but then again, I also understand why. But now we have another game coming out. It's called Horizon Hunter's Gathering, and it's similar to Dauntless, so we will have to wait and see how that game, performs stuff. And of course, a new community will build, but I like to think that Dauntless inspired that game because it is very similar to Dauntless, so we will have to see. But basically, Dauntless was much more than just a game, is what I'm trying to say. And it sucks that it's gone now, so yeah, but anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching my video, and thank you, Dragon Lorn, for having me in his video. And yeah, that's pretty much what Dauntless meant to me. It's a sense of community, and I got to meet a whole bunch of good people, which also included Dragon Lorn as well. Alright, so thank you guys, and again, thank you, Dragon Lorn, for having me. Peace.
Hello everybody, I'm Danny T, or Cinghiale di Ferro. I'm the little YouTuber of the game Dauntless. And sorry for my English, it's not my first language, but I will try to communicate my idea and my opinion about this great game of Dauntless. Okay, let's talk about all the good memory. I want to remember this game only for the good stuff and not talk about the bad stuff. Dauntless was great, first of all, because it was free to play. And this is the first great thing, so everybody can play Dauntless. But not just solely because it was free to play with microtransaction inside, but also because any kind of console or PC low budget was able to run this game. And this was the best things ever, guys. To me, Dauntless is still represent a great game. Doesn't matter if you cannot play anymore. It's still a great game because it was full of great potential. Anyway, I hope someone or any other software house will bring back this game. Maybe with a different name, maybe with few things different, but really I hope this idea of Dauntless will back again. I hope, honestly I hope.
Hello, Shreen Plays here. It's been a while since I've talked about Dauntless, but I think about it every now and again. Every now and again I think about what I would be doing in Dauntless, especially around the holiday seasons like Easter and Christmas, especially Halloween as well. Dauntless was the first ARPG game that I've ever played, and I haven't played one since, and I really miss it, to be honest. I miss making videos about it specifically as well, like that. The interaction with the community through my videos was like something really special that I really do miss. The best memories is meeting random people, joining a monster hunt, meeting random people, teaming up with them for the event, meeting YouTubers through the game as well. I was always excited for the new updates, new behemoths, new abilities, stuff like that, new weapons, new skins, the new hunt passes and stuff. I miss the game overall. I still have hope that Dauntless might come back, or at least some of the developers will make their own studio, or maybe they'll work on a different game and put their kind of Dauntless kind of twist into it. But I don't think that's going to happen. If I'm completely honest with myself, I think Dauntless is completely done. I mean, there are games like Monster Hunter, but Dauntless was such a specific game. And it's hard to describe Dauntless to a person that's never played it before. It's kind of like a feeling rather than, oh yeah, you do this, this and that, or how you play it. Yeah.
So once again, thank you to the guys for coming back on to the podcast again. It's been quite some time since I've spoke to anyone from back in the Dauntless days. And the fact that they dropped what they were doing and contributed towards this podcast is greatly appreciated. And of course, what they mention in terms of what the game meant to them, to myself, to the wider community, they really hit the nail on the head. Community seems to be the key word which we go back to very, very often, the Dauntless community. That is the highlight of the game. That is what brought so many people back. That is, in my opinion, what made Dauntless such an enjoyable game for such a very long time. And that is what's been missed mostly. I mean, the game, of course, the mechanics of the game, the routines of the game, that is something, that is sacred and important. But I believe the community is just as big a deal, if not more, in terms of what it meant to us. Talking about mental health, which is such an important subject, such a delicate subject, and yes, routine and structure, which this game certainly offered in terms of the gameplay, but also community can be such a beneficial factor for those who are struggling with mental health. I mean, this game coincided with, the COVID pandemic. It came out just before it, and its prime was during it. And if there's one thing that many people talked about in terms of on my podcast, or just just friends chatting in the game chat, is that Dauntless offered so much social benefit to people who were deprived of such a thing during the COVID pandemic because of lockdowns and isolations and things like that. It certainly benefited me during a very dark period during that time. I built such a wonderful social circle in terms of friends in the game, or for friends that I made with this channel, and it's people that I'll remember for the rest of my life. That brings us up nicely to what I wanted to talk about next, and that is fond memories. My fondest memories in game, what I enjoyed the most specifically in this game. And I talked about it in a previous podcast episode, and I don't actually think my opinions have changed much since then, so I'm just going to share a clip from that because there's no point repeating myself really. What are my favourite memories? Again, a very difficult one to narrow down, so what I've got is some clips here of funny memories and good memories I have of this game. This is way back when I got my friends into the game, and I wasn't a very established player, and they were very, very unestablished.
Yeah, I'm about to get a mode based up.
Right here is when I stated to my friend, who was the worst at the game, that this was his moment. He could do this, he could kill this thing. It was really good to share moments like that with these guys. They don't play anymore, but we've got some good memories of the game. And you can't talk about good Dauntless memories without talking about some of the glitches you get.
Hey, I'm doing it! I'm doing it! I've made it! I have peaked. I have peaked. I am content now. This game is just perfect. You are one with your
And then who
kind.
can forget Dark Harvest 2020, when the developers seriously misbalanced the amount of items you can get from the in-game event.
Not the same spot though.
I still have several thousand pumpkin transmogs from that event. It's crazy. However, my favourite Dauntless memory is when I finally got the Dark Harvest crown, and that was only last October. It took me years and years of Dark Harvest events to get this crown. I tried so many times, it was very, very difficult. There was actually conspiracy theories online that it was actually impossible to get and the developers had somehow glitched the game, but no, it was just extremely, extremely difficult. I met many different players on that journey, some pleasant, some very, very unpleasant, and very desperate to get that crown. Finally I was matched with a brilliant team who all played their part, and we got the crown. And we had a party in Ramsgate for several hours afterwards, celebrating. I still keep in touch with them sometimes. So basically my opinion remains unchanged. These are still some of my favourite memories in game, especially that Dark Harvest crown moment. That was quite the achievement. But in terms of even more specifics, I guess, you could say, my favourite behemoth was, I don't know, I really liked the Pangar. I thought it was one of the OGs. I really liked the Pangar. Also liked the Savite for the soundtrack and the awesome animations of that behemoth, as well as the phalanx. I really liked the lore and the look and the feel of the phalanx. Such a cool behemoth. My favourite weapon? I don't know. The God Hands, before they nerfed it, was such a cool weapon with that beam of light it had. And I really like the Agaris legendary weapon. I know it wasn't the most offensive, it was more of a healer type weapon, but it was especially useful to me in the earlier stages when I struggled against more difficult behemoths. I also really enjoyed coming up with some really creative builds, some very unique builds. Obviously, most players in Dauntless focus purely on offense, taking down behemoths as quickly as possible. Don't blame them, that gets you at the top of the leaderboards. I got onto the leaderboards fairly often, however, I was never at the top because my builds were not purely offensive. I had a build called the Cold Shell, which purely focused on accumulating as many shields as possible. I can't remember all the specifics, but I remember like dodging attacks would give you a shield, and your lantern would give you a shield, and you accumulated all these shields and you would explode it, dealing a good fair amount of damage on behemoths. And especially on frost escalations and in escalations, you could fly through them in minutes because you would be dealing so much damage and you would be taking essentially no damage at all. I had another build called the Farslayer's Drain. I like to name my build. And essentially it was like a parasitic build which focused a lot on life stealing. And there was a lot of restoration and health, so you would constantly be restoring health, and the more health you had, the more damage you would do, whilst draining the life of the behemoths as well. And it was a bit of it was a bit slower, but it was definitely helpful to people who were, you know, earlier in game, or were in the later stages of the game but were struggling to stay alive. Because it offered so much health, and it was I'd say very low risk but pretty high reward. My favourite hunting ground island, tricky one again. Twilight Domain maybe. Failing that, probably the one that the Phalanx was on. I forget the name of it. I really liked that island. It was really good to look at. And in terms of my favourite escalation, probably the Frost escalation. I think the perks that you got in that escalation suited my builds very, very well, and I just like the aesthetic of it as well. My favourite weapon was my trusty axe. I used the axe about 80% of the time, maybe 75%, with the Warpike being second. I enjoyed the axe. It was slow, it was clumsy, however it dealt pretty good damage if you knew how to use it. The Warpike was obviously much quicker, but again, I just enjoyed using it. The animations and the speed of it just suited me quite nicely. Finally, as I've already mentioned, I love the seasonal events. I've stated it already, I've stated it many times. They knocked it out of the park in Dauntless as far as I'm concerned. The Dark Harvest event was part of my yearly routine. I would spend so much time transcribing the unseen language that was written across Ramsgate, which obviously gave you that in-game, those in-game rewards. I really enjoyed all that kind of stuff. The Frostfall event, the Rams giving event, the Gruck, the giant Gruck, that was ridiculous. I really loved these events, and they, again, alongside the community, just were some of my favourite parts of the game. It'd be interesting to see what your favourite aspects of the game were in the comment sections, maybe. What was your favourite weapon? What was your favourite hunting ground? What was your favourite character? What was your favourite combo? What was your favourite lantern? Event, hunt pass, you name it. Let me know in the comment section what your favourite, most fond memories of Dauntless were. So where did it all go wrong? How did Dauntless go from its absolute prime, around about 2020, 2021, to shutting down in 2025? What caused that? Was there multiple factors? Was it one factor? I mean, some people might argue it was 100% due to the Awakening update. Others could argue the lack of content for such a long time. There's so many different routes that we could go down to discuss this. Just to kind of get us started, I'm going to hand it back over to Danny T, because he touches on a good point, I would say.
I think so. What brought Dauntless to the end was a bad decision and also our community. Our community of players, especially on Steam. So many people with just 5 minutes play a game, 30 minutes, just write it down, this game is rubbish, this game is garbage. And honestly, you can do a review in an hour for a single player game. Makes sense. In an hour, you just skip the tutorial, you start the game, and so on, so on. But in an open world where the concept of training and do stuff is more spread, because it's free to play, so you need to play for lots. It's not like a classic single player. Of course, everything is spread, and write it down a comment or report about this game just after play 30 minutes is not enough. And the web community was seriously harsh against this game. And one of the funny facts was some people that wrote it down really bad comment and still continue to play. So I'm questioning why you do that. Why you do that? If you don't like the game, stop playing. That's it.
So Danny's argument here is that a large factor in the eventual fall of Dauntless was to do from the community itself. Now, don't be fooled into thinking that Danny believed that Dauntless was a perfect game and it was flawless and the community are 100% to blame for what ended up happening. No, that's not the case. Danny was often critical of Dauntless in the dev team and always offered constructive feedback on a lot of the issues, and I think that's key to the point that I believe he's making here. I guess you could say that the Awakening update for Dauntless was disastrous. You'd be right in saying that because ultimately it was. A lot of the predatory tactics they used in terms of the loot boxes and the paywalls and the taking weapons and prestige, all that kind of stuff. Yes, 100%, you can't argue against it. There was some positives of it, and I continue to argue that, but overall it was disastrous. I feel like every new update, every new behemoth, every issue that we faced as a Dauntless community, not everyone, but a large percentage of that would complain and boycott and review bomb and demand answers and fixes from the devs. And yeah, again, I'll keep saying this, much of it was justified. However, not all of it. And I think this constant badgering, this constant frustration, this constant negativity did impact. It has to have impacted. And you look at it across, the world of gaming just now. You look at all these MMOs and all these online games and all these single-player games and development companies. They're constantly struggling now. And again, some of it is due to producing inferior products. However, it's also because just as a human race, we are difficult to please. I don't think that's going to go down well with everyone. However, it is what it is. We are a world of Karens, and we like to complain. And Dauntless may have been subject to this to an extent. Turning to my point, Dauntless originally began as a passion project. It began with people who were keen to create a game which would make people happy. It began with talented artists and developers and animators and computer programmers, whatever else goes into, development teams when creating a game. I don't know the ins and outs. But it was people who were passionate, and it grew and expanded, and there was external companies who stepped in and expanded their resources, and with that sometimes you do lose a little bit of that passion, because when things get bigger, more people get involved, and it's I can imagine it's probably quite tricky to keep that original fire that started the project in the first place. However, at the end of the day, the intentions were good. The game began, people complained about the server issues. Okay, fair enough, but they complained, and a lot of people probably boycotted and left. New behemoths came out. Some of them were incredible. Some of them weren't so incredible. So people criticised and complained about it. New weapons came out, but some people didn't like the weapons that were there. They wanted more weapons, and they complained, boycotted until they got new weapons. new updates came out because they had to jig things up because the replayability just wasn't there and the player base was dying out, and they did so. And again, you can see the point I'm trying to make here. I don't need to go on about it. I'm being quite critical of the community in this aspect, but it's not really just this community, it's just people in general, and I feel like this has had an impact on Dauntless, and it has contributed to the eventual downfall. But now looking at other issues, what other issues might have impacted the downfall of Dauntless? Well, I mean, we talked earlier about, the Reforge updates that may have impacted the game. I mean, Reforge, as I stated, was my favourite Dauntless update. It added a lot of replayability, exploration. I feel like it was an update that was needed at the time. Now, this update split the player base right down the middle. You had people who shared my opinion, and you had people who didn't. And I'm not saying everyone who didn't like the update stopped playing, but again, I feel like there probably was a massive moment in terms of the decline of Dauntless. It might have started that snowball effect, or maybe it was already in effect already. Maybe the numbers were already starting to drop due to the fact that there wasn't a hell of a lot of replayability, or maybe people had reached max, maybe they've reached end game and they were just done with it. So you could argue Reforge was one of one of the first reasons as to why Dauntless began to dwindle. But you could also argue it was maybe starting already. Maybe it was the type of game that when people had played a certain amount of hours, they were done with it. And there's only so many people out there who are interested in a game like Dauntless. So be it the Reforge, or be it just the fact that the game was already beginning to shrink, who's to say? Another thing we talked about earlier was maybe Phoenix Labs biting off a little bit more than it could chew. As we know, Phoenix Labs was developing and eventually released another game and was working on other games in the background. Fae Farm was one of them. And from what I remember, Fae Farm didn't do too well. It didn't sell too well. And it was actually, I played a bit of it on the Nintendo Switch. It was an okay game. It was a pretty good game actually, but I think it was just, the type of game it was. One of those crafting farming simulator type games. I think there's just too many of those games out there, and it basically just got buried under everything else. It was, it had lovely aspects, but it was a little bit generic. And with that failure, maybe that had repercussions, and maybe the fact that they spent so much time working on other games, it took the devs away from Dauntless itself. You look at the amount of updates that came out after Reforge. Yeah, there was a good go at it when the update first came out for the first year, maybe year and a half. However, after that, as we spoke about earlier, the updates began to slow and eventually stop. So you wonder if resources were just stretched a little bit too thin. And maybe that content drought put off too many people. So we've talked about negativity from within the community, which then, I believe, outstretches to the wider community and the world, which is a whole sociological, psychological issue, which we're not going to talk about in any more detail. We've talked about game-breaking updates. Reforge, although I really much like it, many people didn't. We've talked about content droughts and stretching resources with, with other projects like Fae Farm. But content droughts for such a long time, obviously, would be one of the biggest impacting factors, I believe. I mean, you look at between 2022 to 2025, 3 solid years of Dauntless. There was very, very little content in that time. I think Gauntlet came out towards the end of 2023, round about then. And in that entire time, there was nothing really else. There was no hunt passes, there was very few behemoths, there was no weapon updates. It was all recycled content, and I think to have a drought for such a long time, I think many people just start to assume the game's dead. And when that reputation gets out there, that's when you can have a bit of a landslide effect. Now, I play a lot of the Elder Scrolls Online. It's got a pretty damn big community. It always has done. It's always been up there as, one of the top 3-4 MMOs in the world. However, recently, I don't know if you've heard, but Microsoft have let go 50% of the development team working on ESO. And there's a lot of people that are panicking within the community, believing that this could be the beginning of the end for ESO. Now, I don't think that's the case. I think the community is way too big and the game is far too profitable. I think it's more things to do with, implementation of AI. I think it's probably the model going forward. They're not going to be releasing huge seasonal updates anymore. It's more kind of minor incremental updates. I think just they're probably looking at saving money, and I think it really comes down to that. I think the game is beginning to slow, but I don't think it's going away anytime soon. But once a game does get that, get that reputation of being a dead game, people stop playing. I mean, if there's one thing I look at, and I've spent a lot of time in the last year and a half looking at new MMOs and online live service games, if you even sometimes get an inkling that the community is dying or is dead, it can automatically put you off that game. There's been a lot of games I've looked at where the community, there's a lot of criticism and a lot of review bombing and a lot of general reviews just saying the community is dead and it's a dead game. When I see that, it puts me off, because I don't want to put my time, my very, very valuable time, which I don't have much of these days, into a game that isn't going to be around for much longer and there isn't much of a community to share it with it. Now, I don't think that was quite the case with Dauntless, but when it got that reputation, it had to have impacted the amount of new players coming in, which then again just contributes to the fact that the game was struggling and was doomed. What does the development team do when their game is hemorrhaging money and hemorrhaging players, and it seems likely that it's probably going to die a death? Well, you've probably got three options. The first one would be to let it die. The second one would be to increase the amount of funds that you put into it, advertising, the content you put into it. You slowly build up that reputation, that player base again. Or you go all or nothing and you release one big giant update to try and fix it all. It takes you time to make that update, so that means more time without any kind of content, where you'll be hemorrhaging more money and you'll be hemorrhaging more players, but it's all or nothing, and it really comes down to it. And that's what we got that third option. The dev team went for an all-in approach where they applied all their resources and their time and their effort into one update, and that was the Awakening update. And if they got it right, they might have pulled it off. But if they didn't, which they didn't, then Dauntless was doomed to fail. I'm sure there was many, many people behind the scenes that wanted nothing but success for Dauntless. Not that the Phoenix Labs had a particularly big team at this time. However, I'm sure a good 95% of them wanted the game to have a bright future. For both themselves and for the community, I'm sure. However, when you've got horrible, corrupt, money, greedy, grubbing companies like 40 Labs who come in and take over essentially and implement, or try their best to implement, these kind of cutthroat predatory tactics, such as unfair microtransactions and paywalls and things like that. There's only so much people can do, and that's exactly what happened, because again, as I've said many times in the past, there was so much to like about Awakening. There were so many good ideas out there. However, you could see exactly where the dev team were limited on what they could do. You could see there was so much good out there that could have happened, but you could see the greed, and you could see the tactics, and you could see all the things that were put in place to try and strip as much money from as many people as possible, such as predatory, unfair microtransactions and paywalls and things like that, that sorely were just too bad and ultimately caused this update to be horrendous. So in relation to this, I'm going to take you to a post by Cinco, who was a community player manager, and they posted on the official Dauntless Discord. In fact, it was one of the final posts from the devs on the official Discord. And basically they state that they talks about community and how wonderful the Dauntless community was, and that they felt compelled to write a message. It talks about Phoenix Labs and how good the community within Phoenix Labs was, and how well they felt they treated their player base as well. They said that the company was spun up and very genuine people, and though staff changed over time, the attitude never changed. Cinco then talks about their Dauntless experience. So my initial experience was, this isn't my kind of game. So why can't I stop having fun? The crazy part is that never changed. Maybe it's the type of game, or maybe it's just simply special and I'll miss it. They state that my thoughts on the update, which I know not everyone agrees on, I love the Behemoth streamlining, the weapon designs were nothing short of incredible. I'm sorry we didn't have time to clear some of the biggest issues up for players and get the Pangar rolling down on the snowbank building up speed. Some have asked about the future of Dauntless. This isn't clear, and I don't want to get hopes up, as there's no clear path forward, but it doesn't mean there's none. That's actually quite promising. I wish I'd actually read this earlier. That fills me with a shred of hope, actually. We'll be setting the Discord to view only at some point in the very near future, which they've done now, instead of closing it all together. So basically it seems that they're continuing this Discord in the hopes that Dauntless has a revival. That is very promising. Cinco states don't get your hopes up, but it's interesting. Dauntless is an old game now, and while I'm sad to see it go, with so many games coming and going, I'm also happy to see that it brought joy to so many people for such a long time. These are really, really wise and relevant words, I would say. Cinco then talks about the gaming industry. As many know, the industry is in a rough place. And quite frankly, I would say since this post went up, we've seen it getting even rougher. I mean, you look at the Microsoft layoffs just now and what's going on with physical gaming. There's so much going on in gaming just now, and the overall price of gaming going up as well. So the industry is in a rough place, with a boom during COVID and then almost back to normal. The growth wasn't sustainable, and it caused a lot of pain for developers. Please be kind and thoughtful in feedback in any game you play. Remember to be constructive when bringing up issues. Bring up general ideas, solutions, or simply why something is bothering you. There may be a creative way around it. Allow designers to design and delight. We're all humans, we try our best, but we don't always get it right. Remember to be kind on a human level. Right, so now getting to the point as to why I brought up this post in the first place. So, acquisitions. Cinco states that I saw Garena blamed for some of the gripes in Dauntless. From my perspective, they didn't get into the day-to-day with Dauntless, but did support Phoenix Labs. I don't know any high-level stuff, so maybe my perspective is off, but let's not blame unknowingly. I felt treated well, but clearly they felt the need to cut us. And then, interestingly, they talk about 40 Labs. I won't get into the 40 stuff, it's not my place. I'll just say we did last longer because of this acquisition. Takeaways from this post is acknowledgement, in terms of acknowledging that they didn't quite hit the mark with this update, and they didn't always get things right. However, another key word I would use would be kindness or understanding. And this goes back to what I was talking about the player base, the community, and the world in general in terms of their reception to development companies. People are just human. Yes, there are some dirty devs out there, but I feel like we do turn on people a little bit quicker than we maybe should. Have issues, then yeah, raise them. However, be constructive in your feedback and be positive in your approach, and maybe acknowledge talent when you get a chance. Interesting, there's only a very short sentence about 40 Labs. I think in the positive spin on it, I can understand as well. I mean, I agree to an extent. The acquisition with 40 Labs most likely did extend the time that we had Dauntless. It probably did, because we talked about earlier, Dauntless was beginning to struggle. And 40 Labs coming on board, I'm sure they pumped a bit more money and a bit more resources into the development team. However, in my personal experience, in my working managerial experience, I have found with controversial topics, if I have to discuss it with a team in a team meeting or something like that, sometimes the less said the better, and I feel like that's maybe the approach that's been used here. I can imagine there's probably a lot more that maybe could be stated here, but sometimes it's safe and sometimes it's wise to say less. So to summarise, I don't think there was any one specific reason that caused the end of Dauntless. I think the Awakening update was certainly the straw that broke the camel's back, and it certainly accelerated the process. But Dauntless was already on a downward spiral. I mean, you could look all the way back to the very beginning with, the issues at launch with servers. You could look to the Reforge update, where, it split the player base in half in terms of what people wanted and didn't want. You could look at content droughts, long periods of content droughts where, the development team were spread thin across other projects. You could look at negativity from within the community, review bombing and people complaining about every single little aspect that there was. Or you could look at these horrible companies like 40 Labs who came in and turned our wonderful game into a monster. But what's done is done, and Dauntless is now gone. But this could be a good learning point for all of us. For us within the community, maybe we could be a bit more positive. Maybe we could celebrate development teams who genuinely have good intentions and enthusiasm. Development teams like Phoenix Labs could be a little bit more careful when they gamble and a bit more consistent with how they release things. I mean, not spreading themselves too thin across different development projects and ensuring that the game that has basically got them to the stage they're at, the stage they got to, is getting the attention and the love and care that it deserves. Maybe horrible, greedy companies like 40 Labs could look back on this and say, you know what? We could be better. We could maybe be a little bit less cutthroat, a little bit less predatory, a little bit less scummy. But I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. Okay, so with that horrible subject out of the way, which did need to be discussed, we're going to look, a bit more positively now about the future. Now, a lot of this is going to be very unlikely. This is just wish listing. Things Shireen stated earlier on, although she said it was very unlikely, she would like to see Dauntless return in some shape or form. Or she would even like to see the developers who worked on Dauntless bring their skills and create almost a similar experience. This is where I'd really like to get your thoughts in the comment sections. It'd be interesting to see what you would like to see for the future. We're all devastated the game's gone. It's been over a year since it shut down, and a lot of us haven't moved on. So what would you like to see? What would appease you? What would keep you happy or ensure, that Dauntless lives on with you? Let me know in the comment section, please. In my opinion, the best thing that could possibly happen, the best scenario that could ever play out, would be that I log on to, my socials or YouTube, or there's a gaming conference coming up, and we get a trailer for a Dauntless 2. How amazing would that be? You see something similar to what we've seen back at E3 2017-18. I could talk for days. In fact, I could do an entire podcast on what I would like to see in a Dauntless 2. That's not something I plan on doing unless it was announced, because that'd probably be an enormous waste of time. But that is what I would like to see, and it would make me very, very happy. Unfortunately, I don't think that ever will happen. I think the Dauntless IP is most likely locked away in the vaults of 40 Labs or whatever, and it'll never see the light of day again, most likely, which is quite depressing. However, I think it's a scenario that we just probably need to accept and move on from. Another scenario I'd like to see is that we somehow manage to get our own private fan-owned servers. If the game fell into the hands of the fan base and the community, and we got our own servers. Now, this has happened in the past. There have been games that have went under or have struggled, MMO games. Can't remember any off the top of my head. Please, if you have any that come to mind, again, leave them in the comment section. But if that was to happen, it would be very nice. However, these types of situations can be quite tricky in terms of, server issues and lag and bugs and ongoing content. You do find these situations are great, but they're not ideal. Sometimes having those horrible big development companies with money to fund good servers is what's needed. Another situation, which would be quite nice, but not quite as good as a Dauntless 2 would be the Wayfinder approach. Now, you look at Wayfinder, it's actually a really good game. There's a lot to like about Wayfinder. However, it too kind of died a death. The servers went offline. But the dev team did the right thing, in my opinion, that they kept the game open to the players, as a single player, and am I right in thinking a co-op player experience, Dauntless, but without the online aspect. And even, if there was some kind of split screen or some kind of direct online co-op type aspect, that would be incredible. Not quite the perfect situation in my opinion, because again, part of the Dauntless experience for me was the wider community, things like that, but it would be a pretty good situation which would make me very happy. Another scenario which I believe is most likely, probably what will actually happen, is what Shireen talks about, is almost like a spiritual successor. Now, you could say Dauntless is kind of a spiritual successor in itself. A lot of people obviously said it copied that, Monster Hunter gameplay aspect. But Dauntless was more unique in my opinion. I've never agreed with those types of conversation. I enjoy the game Temtem. I don't know if you've heard of Temtem, but it's a wonderful IP. It's a monster catching game, like Pal World, or Pokemon. I do not believe a type of game, a genre of game, belongs to the biggest company who have defined it. Monster Hunter is the champion of monster hunting games, but it doesn't mean it has to be the only Monster Hunter game. Pokemon is the ultimate, monster catching game. Doesn't mean there should only be Pokemon. That's just the way, in my opinion. But if there was a game to come out with a very similar goal, with maybe similar developers, maybe people who were part of Dauntless and moved to this new project, if there was a game that came out which was a spiritual successor to Dauntless, I would be very happy with that. It's a game that I would give it my time, I would give it my passion, and I would give it a chance. And I think that is a scenario that we will see one day. Now, I've already been looking for this in the weeks, months, and now years since Dauntless shut down, and I am yet to find that game that scratches that Dauntless itch for me so far. I found a couple of games that I am interested in, and I will be moving towards with this channel, but I haven't found my Dauntless yet. But I do believe we will have it one day. I believe there'll be a game that will come out, and it will be the new Dauntless for me and for many players like me. Yeah, as I said, if you have any thoughts on this, on the future, what do you believe are the most likely scenarios that we're going to see? What would you like to see the most? What would be your dream situation for the future of Dauntless now that the game is gone? I'm very interested to hear what you have to say, so please leave it in the comment section below and let me know. So we've now talked about a great many things. We've talked about the entire history timeline of Dauntless, from the alpha way back in 2017 right up until the lights went out in 2025. We've talked about fond memories and how amazing the community was. I've talked about where it all went wrong. And we've also spoken about what we'd maybe like to see in the future. What is our wish list, however unlikely that may be. The final thing I want to talk about before we finish up is, where am I going with this channel? What do I plan on doing with it? Now, I started this channel way back in 2020, kind of late spring 2020. Obviously during the COVID pandemic, when I had a lot of time, I had a lot of enthusiasm for video games and all forms of media. I was a collector, so I did a lot of unboxing videos. I was interested in gaming lore, so I did a lot of lore videos. yeah, I had very little responsibility at the time, and it was a passion project of mine. I really poured a lot of time into this channel. Now, as the years went by and the world opened back up again following the COVID pandemic, and I got older, I graduated from university, and my daughter was born, and I got married, and all the things that come to you in life in terms of responsibilities and time-consuming responsibilities just began to take over. And I decided a couple of years ago, I shared an update on this channel, that I was going to stop worrying so much about, petty, stressful things in life like my work. And I was going to really start enthusing a bit more about my video game hobbies, because it was something that made me happy. At that time, just to fill you in, I had quite a stressful role. I had a very stressful job at the time. It was a managerial position, and it took a lot out of me. And I found that going back to this YouTube channel, it really helped distract me, and it really just helped me. It brought me to my safe space. And I decided then that one of the things that bugged me about the channel was that I was all over the place. I was doing all different kinds of things, and I didn't really narrow down on one kind of subject. It's just the way my mind works. I like to focus on something specific. That's why I just poured so much time specifically into Dauntless, and that's what I decided. I decided a couple of years ago I was only going to share Dauntless content, and that's what I did for a couple of years. And then Dauntless shut down, and then with it went my enthusiasm and my interest in creating any kind of content. Now, in the year and a half since I did stop making content, I did try here and there to find a replacement game, something to focus 100% of my attention on, like I did with Dauntless, but there was just no games that were clicking. I usually play a lot of the Elder Scrolls Online, but there's just so many amazing content creators out for the Elder Scrolls Online, and many of which know the game so much better than I do. So I just didn't want to make content for a game that I felt I wasn't educated enough on. I even thought about Warframe, but my goodness, if you know anything about Warframe, you'll know exactly how complex that game is. And again, it's just not something I was educated enough on. I looked at a lot of kind of bigger games, but the problem that I find with a lot of bigger games is there's just so many damn good content creators out there that share all the content, and I would just be replicating that, copying that, I wouldn't be achieving anything within that community, in my opinion. So the way that I've been thinking is looking at smaller communities, looking at indie developers, looking at indie games, and specifically looking at maybe live service games, MMO lights, things like that. Despite the dark place that MMOs as a genre currently finds itself, and that many big MMOs are struggling just now, many smaller ones are shutting down. You've got greedy devs, you've got dev teams that just do not understand their community and then face a lot of backlash when the game they release is a bit of an abomination. And as I said, I play a lot of Elder Scrolls Online, but if there's one thing that really annoys me and I find prevents me from pouring more time into the game, is that there is just so many currencies in that game now. There's so many ways that the Microsoft or ZeniMax, whoever it is that's pulling the strings, there's so many ways that they're trying to just extract money from their community that they're forgetting what is most important, and that is the game itself. And it's just a little bit exhausting, and I'm seeing that across the board with many of these bigger MMOs just now, and even some smaller ones. I know there's some exceptions. I know, there's Final Fantasy Online, which has a very good reputation. There's old school RuneScape. World of Warcraft, there's a lot to like about World of Warcraft just now. I'm not going to slate all big MMOs, but you do feel like a lot of the bigger ones are difficult to immerse yourself in just now because of so many different tactics put in place by the dev teams to extract money from you. But in my opinion, one of the saving graces that I have found is smaller MMOs, indie MMOs, MMO lights, things like that. I've been playing a lot of a game called Forever. It's a really enjoyable game. It's still in its early access, and it's a little rough around the edges. Gameplay's great. It's affordable. It's fair, and there's very little pulling you out of that immersion in that gameplay loop. Currently, in its current state. I've been playing a bit of a game called Fellowship, which is essentially an online dungeon crawler. In fact, it does have some similarities to the structure of Dauntless, for those that might be interested. It's a very good game. It basically takes the end-game elements of a game like World of Warcraft, you know, that those in-game dungeon crawling elements, and puts you right into the gameplay right there. There's no side quests or story modes or anything like that. It's basically just a hub world and dungeons, and it's really good. It's good for someone at my stage in life who doesn't have, you know, huge amounts of time, and it gets you right into the nitty gritty gameplay of PvE dungeon crawling. So you can see where I'm going with this. Currently, as it stands, I don't have a specific game that I'm going to narrow in on like I did with Dauntless. However, looking at almost the subgenre of MMO lights and indie MMOs, I find myself really interested in these kind of games, and I think this is an opportunity for me to use this channel. So my plan is to begin making content for some of these smaller games, these live service games, by shedding light on what they have to offer, maybe diving into things like the lore, the characters, the worlds, things like that. Maybe when I get good enough I can start looking into build. And finally, I really do enjoy creating these podcasts. Making this Dauntless Discussion podcast has been my pride and joy on YouTube for many years now, and I'd like to continue doing it in some way. So basically I do plan on beginning a new podcast very similar to the structure and the theme of the one that I currently use just now, however using it to focus specifically on the games that I will be covering. Despite the new subjects that I'll be covering with this new podcast, I plan on continuing to bring it from the Broken Blade Tavern from Dauntless. I think it's my way of allowing Dauntless to continue on. I will use it for my podcasts as a background, like I've done for all the Dauntless Discussion podcast episodes, just to allow Dauntless to live on in some way. And that, my friends, is the end. I've talked long enough, I've rambled on long enough. However, I need to bring this podcast to a close because I can feel my voice beginning to disappear. Coming back to make this podcast episode and creating the video that I released a couple of days ago about the final moments before the server shut down on Dauntless, it's been challenging to say the least. When the game originally shut down, I could not even look at the footage I had. I just didn't really want to talk about it, and it's taken me time to get over that and to adjust and then to pick myself back up again. So I would just really like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has watched, is tuned in for the podcast, everyone who has contributed towards the conversations and the ongoing chats in the comment sections. I'd like to thank everyone who's been on the show. Their input has been appreciated for every single episode, every person that's joined. And finally, I'd like to thank the devs who created Dauntless in the first place. As many others who've joined the podcast have said, and many in the comment sections as well have said, Dauntless was a rock in a time that many people needed it. It was in its prime during a very difficult time for most people in society, when people were at their loneliest, and it gave so many people wonderful, wonderful friends. I have made an incredible social circle directly through this game, and it's something that I'll be ever grateful for. But that will about do it for today. This is Dragonlorn coming to you from the Broken Blade Tavern in Ramsgate in the Shattered Isles of Dauntless for the very last time. Until next time,